Everyone said the lake was still sleeping, but I knew better. The water never sleeps. It listens. It remembers. That morning, I stood at the century-old dam, my hands wrapped around the cold brass wheel my grandfather once turned every spring. The air carried that deep, earthy scent that only rises when secrets come up from the bottom, a mix of silt, old leaves, and something older still. Across the drained lake bed, million-dollar construction equipment sat half buried in black. Mud, engines silent, their shiny metal already losing the battle to the muck. Diesel fumes clung faintly to the air, fading under the stronger smell of exposed sediment. I took a slow sip from my grandfather's dented steel thermos, the same one he'd used when he built this dock, and taught me that some things in life were worth protecting no matter the cost. He used to stand here at dawn, coffee in hand, watching the mist lift off the water like a curtain on a stage. Back then, Timberlake was clear enough to see 20 feet down, where base swam lazy circles in the shadows of the old dock. Back then, there were no outsiders in designer sunglasses telling us what was up to code. The shouting across the mud broke my thoughts. The site foreman's voice carried through the still air, sharp with panic, barking into a radio about environmental disaster and federal investigations. I didn't have to imagine the look on their faces, men who thought they could buy and bulldoze whatever they wanted, suddenly realizing nature wasn't the only thing they'd underestimated. But this moment didn't happen overnight, and it sure as hell didn't happen because I got lucky. It happened because Constance Piton made one mistake. She thought she could take my family's land and get away with it. I guess the story really starts 3 years ago when I was 52, and living a life quiet enough to hear the loons call before sunrise. My place sat on 47 acres of Wisconsin lakefront, land my grandfather bought in 1924 for $300 and a handshake. He saw something here most folks didn't, a future worth passing down. And for 3 generations we kept it that way. The morning it all began, I had just returned from a 2-week engineering job downstate. My tires crunched over the familiar gravel of my driveway, the sound that always told me I was home. But before I could shut off the truck, I saw them. Bright orange survey stakes hammered into the ground along my shoreline, like someone had drawn a map without asking me. That's when Constance's white Escalade came fishtailing down my drive, gravel spraying behind it. She swung the SUV sideways across the entrance, stepped out in boots that probably cost more than my truck payment, and gave me a smile sharp enough to draw blood. In her hands was a clipboard thick with legal documents. Ezra. "Perfect timing," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of false warmth salespeople use before they slide the bill across the table. She launched into a polished speech about an emergency HOA meeting that had taken place while I was gone. The vote was unanimous, she said, a community enhancement project. 120 luxury cabins to elevate property values, right here on my shoreline. I told her my family had owned this land for nearly a century, that the deed was clear. She waved it away like a mosquito. That old survey is probably inaccurate anyway. Things change. Progress happens, she said. Then she hit me with the line I'd replay in my head for months. I think we can all agree your little cabin doesn't fit our vision for Timberlake's future. My little cabin, the place my father learned to fish, the place my son learned to skip stones, the place where the walls still smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine sap. Not upscale enough for her vision. She left with her taillights disappearing down my road, perfume lingering in the cold air like a warning. And I remembered my grandfather's voice, low and certain on this same dock. Sometimes you've got to fight for what's right, even when the deck's stacked against you, especially then. It started small, quiet hours that somehow applied. Only to me, dock inspections with violations written the same week the rules were invented. Neighbors I'd shared coffee and bait with started avoiding eye contact. And every time I asked questions, the HOA board, her board, closed ranks. But here's the thing about being a civil engineer. I know how to read the fine print. And when someone tries to bury you in paperwork, you dig. You dig until you hit bedrock. In the basement of the county courthouse, under the hum of flickering fluorescent lights, I found it. The words in my grandfather's deed that would change everything. Riparian rights, extending to the center of the lake. Not just dirt and trees, water. Rights no one in that HOA had bothered to understand. That was the first crack in their foundation. They just didn't know it yet. 3 days after I found the clause in my grandfather's deed, I was back on the dock with my morning coffee, steam curling into the crisp air. The water was still, reflecting the sky like glass. And for a moment, I let myself pretend things were normal. That's when the rumble of a truck broke the silence. A shiny pickup rolled into my driveway, and out stepped a man in a polo shirt with Timberlake community standards, stitched neatly on the chest pocket. He looked at me like I'd been caught doing something shameful. "Sir, cease that activity immediately," he said, pointing not at a chainsaw or a bonfire, but at my coffee cup. Apparently, my boots on the dock at 6 in the morning violated newly created quiet hours. That was just the appetizer. The next day, a clipboard warrior showed up to inspect my dock, the same one my grandfather built by hand. He declared it a safety hazard, citing 17 separate violations that hadn't existed the week before. The repair estimate? $50,000, more than I'd paid for my truck. It became clear that Constance's plan wasn't just to take my land, she was going to make staying unbearable. Margaret from the garden club suddenly had strong feelings about my non-compliant shoreline vegetation. Bob from down the road, who used to wave every morning, now studied the ground when I drove past. The message was simple. You're not welcome here anymore, but intimidation has a funny effect on me. It makes me curious. My father used to say, when someone's trying to screw you with paperwork, the devil's in the details they hope you won't find. So I went back to the courthouse, my yellow legal pad in hand, and kept digging. The HOA's incorporation papers? Rushed, incomplete, missing signatures. Their meeting minutes? Riddled with procedural violations. But the real gold was in a manila envelope that slid under the courthouse door one afternoon when I was working. Inside were environmental impact studies, the kind required before you can build anything on a lakeshore, or at least the kind you're supposed to file. Turns out the Petons had skipped that part entirely. I knew exactly what to do. I filed a formal complaint with the State Environmental Agency, attaching photographs, surveys, and my own engineering analysis. Their reply came faster than I expected. Construction suspended pending full environmental review. That's when I realized Constance wasn't just ambitious, she was dangerous. Because the very next morning, her white Escalade tore down my driveway, brakes squealing, her eyes like knives. She didn't bother with fake smiles this time. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she said, jabbing a manicured finger at my chest. I met her gaze. "Is that a threat, Constance?" "It's a promise," she snapped. "This project is happening, with or without your cooperation. Maybe you should think about your future around here." The way she said future made the hair on my neck stand up. This wasn't about cabins anymore. This was about power, the kind that comes with money, connections, and no conscience. That night, I sat on my dock watching construction lights flicker across the North Shore. They were still working on other lots, bulldozers moving like restless animals under the glow of halogens. That's when I remembered another thing my grandfather used to say. People in a hurry to get rich always leave mistakes behind, and sure enough, the mistakes started to show. At 3:47 a.m., a few nights later, I woke to the crunch of boots outside my bedroom window. 2 men in black tactical gear were patrolling my shoreline, flashlights sweeping the water. They claimed they were private security, ensuring community safety. The acrid smell of their cigarettes drifted through my screen. When I stepped onto the porch, one of them told me I was creating a disturbance by turning on my own porch light. By the end of the week, the county had gated off the old access road to my property. A keypad lock now barred the way and, surprise, my name wasn't on the authorized list. My 15-minute drive into town became a 40-minute detour. It wasn't just inconvenience. It was isolation. The whispers started at Kowalski's Hardware, where I'd shopped for 20 years. Pete wouldn't meet my eyes when he said, "Sorry, Ezra, can't extend credit anymore, orders from above." At the diner, conversations died when I walked in. Karen, the good kind of Karen, leaned over my table to whisper that Constance was telling people I'd been unstable since my divorce. That I might do something dangerous with all my engineering knowledge. I'd been in enough fights to know this wasn't random. This was psychological warfare. They were trying to break me before the real fight even began. That Saturday, I drove into town and walked into the Historical Society. I needed history, and I needed it fast. Mrs. Henderson, the volunteer librarian, brought me a stack of dusty boxes with a conspiratorial smile. "Terrible what they're doing to you, dear, but these lumber company records might interest you." She wasn't exaggerating. Timberlake hadn't always been a lake. It was a log pond created in 1923 when the Northwood Lumber Company built a dam to float timber downstream. When the company folded during the Depression, the dam was left in a kind of legal limbo. The ownership had never been properly transferred to anyone, which meant it was still private property, abandoned, forgotten, waiting for someone who understood its value, and I understood perfectly. The blueprint was faded, edges curled from nearly a century in storage. I traced the ink lines with my finger. The thick timbers, the brass control wheels, the spillway gates. In the corner, in a hand so neat it could have been drafted yesterday, was the note. Manual operation maintained for emergency flood control. That wasn't just a historical footnote. That was authority. That was leverage. Monday morning, I followed the paper trail through the State Revenue Office, 3 departments, and 4 cups of bitter coffee. The clerk, a woman with the tired patience of someone who had spent 30 years in the same chair, finally found what I was looking for: the dam's tax record. "Northwood's Dam," she said, squinting at the screen. "Well, I'll be unpaid taxes. 15 years worth, $847. Wisconsin law says I can purchase for the amount owed, right?" I asked. She adjusted her glasses. "If you want it, it's yours." I had spent more than that on a weekend in Chicago. But this was worth more than any vacation, because the specs said I could legally lower the lake by 8 feet without violating flood control rules. 8 feet would expose every foundation Constance's crews had poured. It would also stir up whatever had been lying under 70 years of lake bed. By the time I drove home, the purchase agreement sat in my glove compartment, my signature still wet. That night, another note appeared under my windshield wiper. Final warning. Take the offer and disappear. The handwriting was jagged, the letters pressed hard into the paper, like someone had written it with anger in their bones. Across the water, construction lights blazed against the dark, crews working through the night. They were in a race, though they didn't know I'd already joined it. I started testing the dam controls under the cover of pre-dawn. The brass wheels were cold under my palms, the metal creaking with a kind of stubborn dignity. Each turn let me feel the weight of the water pressing against the gates, the deep, steady rush that came when you opened them even a fraction. My grandfather would have called it listening to the lake breathe. But Constance must have sensed I was up to something because her next move was like a punch to the ribs. A black sedan rolled into my driveway one Wednesday morning. Out stepped a man in an expensive suit, briefcase in hand, smile polished for. "The courtroom. Mr. Blackwood, I'm attorney Winston Carril, representing the Timberlake Homeowners Association." I have here a restraining order preventing you from interfering with legitimate community development. He slid the papers across my dock railing like he was dealing me a losing hand. The language was neat and cold. I was prohibited from operating, tampering with, or even approaching any water control structures within the township. This is temporary, of course, he said, with the smugness of someone who already thinks they've won. A restraining order on the dam. They'd figured it out. By Thursday, they were cutting down oaks on my property, trees that had stood for over 100 years. The sound of chainsaws ripped across the lake like mechanical screams. The water near my dock turned brown. Fish, floating belly up as runoff from the construction site, bled into the lake. The smell was sharp and wrong, a chemical bitterness that clung to the back of your throat. I called the sheriff, got voicemail, called the county supervisor. "We'll look into it," called the state environmental office. "Sir, we're still processing your complaint." Nobody was coming. That night, I sat on the dock with a glass of bourbon, staring across at the glow of the construction lights. I thought about my grandfather standing in this same spot, telling me there were fights you had to take, even when you knew you'd get bloodied, especially then. Friday morning, Carelli was back, this time with a sheriff's deputy. "Emergency court hearing Monday," he said, "to make the restraining order permanent." They wanted my control over the dam gone for good. I didn't sleep much that weekend, but I did spend hours at the dam, tracing the mechanics, memorizing every turn, every resistance point, every sound the gates made when they moved. I thought about what 8 feet of water meant to a shoreline full of fresh concrete. I thought about how much faster truth moves when it rides the current. Then, late Sunday night, I got a call from Delilah Santos, the county's only reporter worth her ink. Her voice was sharp, alive. "Ezra, I've been digging into the Petons. Finances," she said. "They're broke, and this project, it's the only thing keeping them from losing everything." She went on. Unpaid debts, failed developments in Illinois, lawsuits buried under shell companies. And then the part that made me sit straighter. Half the homeowners on the lake had never received notice of the emergency HOA meeting, where they voted to take my land, which meant the entire vote was illegal. Delilah paused for breath. "And one more thing. Your dam? If you drop the water level far enough, the EPA thinks you'll expose decades of buried contamination. If it's confirmed, the feds take control of the lake. No development, no exceptions. Federal control." That was a hammer no local court could block. By the time she hung up, the plan was already forming in my head. The Monday hearing was at 2 p.m., but the dam didn't keep office hours. By dawn Monday, my kitchen table looked like a war room. Coffee brewing nonstop, 3 laptops open, papers spread out like maps before a battle. Every move had to be timed perfectly, because once I turned that brass wheel, there'd be no turning back. First call was to Jasper Tooley, a retired park ranger who'd been quietly photographing the construction mess since the first bulldozer arrived. Jasper's voice came through the line like gravel and oak smoke. "Son, I've got pictures of 'em dumping concrete into spawning beds, chemicals leaching into groundwater, sediment clouds killing base fingerlings. You give me the go, I'll have federal inspectors on site in 48 hours. Make it 24, I told him, and be ready for something dramatic." Next was Camden Cross, an environmental lawyer who had a reputation for taking down developers twice. His size. His voice was practically buzzing. "This is perfect, Ezra. We file simultaneous suits in federal and state courts. Clean Water Act, NEPA violations, Wisconsin environmental statutes. They won't have enough lawyers to keep up." "Federal jurisdiction beats any restraining order," I reminded him. "Exactly," Camden said. "If contamination is confirmed, no judge in this country can let construction continue." Meanwhile, Delilah was setting up the other prong of the attack, media and public outrage. She'd called 3 environmental groups and 2 investigative reporters from Milwaukee. By morning, her exposé would hit every local station and newspaper. I've got drone footage of the runoff, copies of the HOA's illegal vote minutes, and recorded calls of Constance trying to bribe county officials, Delilah told me. By lunchtime, every politician in this county will be pretending they've never heard of her. The timing was everything. Court at 2 p.m., me at the dam at dawn, EPA inspectors arriving mid-morning. By the time Constance was standing in front of Judge Martinez, she'd already be neck-deep in a federal investigation. But desperate people do desperate things, and Constance didn't disappoint. At 3 a.m. Tuesday, the sound of metal snapping jolted me out of bed. I knew that sound. Bolt cutters. I grabbed my flashlight and looked toward the dam. Flashlight beams danced over the control housing. Sparks flew as someone used a cutting torch. 3 men in dark clothing were working fast, trying to disable the manual controls. They didn't count on Jasper's volunteer security detail. 3 retired military guys who'd been rotating. Watch shifts since the threat started. Hey! Jasper's voice boomed across the water. You boys lost! The would-be saboteurs scrambled, the sound of their boots hammering the dock, then a truck engine roaring to life before peeling out into the night. All they left behind was a cut, fence and scorch marks on the dam housing. By breakfast, Constance tried a different angle. The county building inspector, the same one who'd rubber-stamped every violation against me, showed up with a new complaint. My cabin's electrical system was unsafe and required immediate professional rewiring. Price tag? $12,000, paid up front to county-approved contractors who just happened to be booked for the next 6 months. Safety first, Mr. Blackwood, he said with a straight face. That afternoon, the local paper ran a front page story painting me as unstable and obsessed with controlling water levels to the detriment of the community. Anonymous sources, almost certainly her bridge club, claimed I was acting aggressively toward construction workers and talking to myself on walks. They forgot to mention I was on the phone every time. But the pièce de résistance came Friday evening. The county sheriff knocked on my door with a court order, an emergency psychiatric hold signed by a judge in the next county. They were going to keep me in lockup for evaluation just long enough to miss the Monday hearing. It almost worked. Camden had been expecting a play like this. He filed an emergency motion challenging the order's jurisdiction and called in Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a forensic psychiatrist known for slicing through political nonsense with clinical precision. After 3 hours of testing, she looked at me and shook her head. This order is medically baseless. I'll have my report filed before dinner. By Saturday afternoon, I was free. And Camden had discovered that the judge who'd signed the order was a golf buddy of Braden Peaton, Constance's husband. That kind of connection wasn't just shady, it was career-ending. While I'd been stuck in an evaluation room, Delilah's expose had gone live. Shell companies, bribed officials, environmental violations, it was all out in the open. Drone footage of chemical drums being dumped into the lake was running on repeat across every local news channel. By Sunday morning, Constance made her boldest move yet, an emergency county meeting to seize the dam under flood control powers. It was classic small-town corruption. No notice, no media, just 3 commissioners in a courthouse basement. Problem for her? Jasper's network had ears everywhere. By 9:45 a.m., the courthouse steps were swarming with environmental protesters, property rights activists, and news crews. Judge Martinez herself showed up and shut the whole thing down with one sentence. Any attempt to alter water rights during a pending federal investigation will be challenged in my courtroom. Constance left without a word, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew the clock was running out. Across the lake, her crews were working triple shifts now, pouring foundations below the natural water line in a desperate push to finish before the hammer fell. And that was the mistake I'd been waiting for, because in less than 24 hours the water level was going to drop, and everything they'd tried to bury was going to rise. Monday morning, 5:30 a.m. The air was cold enough to bite, but my palms were sweating against the brass wheels of the dam. I'd studied the 1923 schematics so many times I could see them even with my eyes closed. Every bolt, every gear, every exact turn needed to make the lake fall at a precise rate. 8 feet in 4 hours. Enough to expose every foundation her crews had poured. Enough to let the lake tell its own story. The first groan of metal echoed across the water, deep and resonant. Then came the rush, a steady, roaring breath as Timberlake began to empty. Mist rose off the swirling current, and I felt it in my chest, the moment the fight turned from defense to offense. Across the lake, construction lights were still on from the night shift. Diesel engines coughed to life, but radio chatter carried over the water, clipped, panicked. Waters dropping fast, shut down the concrete trucks. By 7 a.m., mud flats stretched where water had been just hours before. Foundations, still slick with curing concrete, stood exposed like bones under skin. And then the real truth started to surface. The smell hit first, sharp, chemical, wrong. Patches of rainbow sheen floated across the shallows. Rusted machinery, broken barrels, jagged chunks of concrete poked up from the muck. Some of the drums still had faded hazmat symbols on them, the paint cracked but unmistakable. 70 years of buried poison, finally breathing air. Right on time, 3 black SUVs rolled up to the dam. Federal EPA agents, led by Dr. Sarah Bennett. A woman with the kind of calm authority that doesn't waste words. She took one look at the exposed mess and muttered, "Jesus Christ, this is a Superfund site waiting to happen." News crews clustered behind them, cameras whirring, drones buzzing overhead. Jasper stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching like a man who'd been waiting years for this. At 8:30, the white Escalade roared down the road, gravel spraying in all directions. Constance climbed out, dressed in designer jeans and panic. Her face, usually arranged into that perfectly controlled smile, was cracking under the weight of what she saw. "You can't do this!" she shouted, storming toward me. "That damn operation is illegal. I have a restraining order." Dr. Bennett stepped between us without even glancing her way. "Mr. Blackwood is operating under Federal Environmental Protection Authority. Your local restraining order is superseded by federal jurisdiction." The words landed like a hammer. You could see the realization hit her. This wasn't just a PR problem. This was federal. Federal meant no control, no friends to call, no favors to cash in. "This contamination didn't come from our project," she said, voice trembling. "It was already here. We're the victims." That's when Buck Morrison walked up, holding his trail camera. He played the footage for Bennett. Braden's crews dumping fresh chemical drums into the lake just 3 nights ago. Clear labels. EPA violation stickers. Braden himself giving orders. Bennett's voice stayed even, but the steel in it was unmistakable. Environmental forensics can distinguish between historic contamination and recent dumping. What we're seeing here is both. The crowd around us was growing. Activists, property owners, reporters. Judge Martinez arrived, took in the scene, and said, "I think we can cancel this afternoon's hearing. Federal law takes precedence here." That's when Constance broke. Her voice rose, brittle with desperation. "You're all being manipulated. This man is a domestic terrorist who's destroyed our community's economic future out of spite and mental illness." The crowd went dead quiet. Every camera lens swung toward me. I walked forward slowly, holding the original 1924 dam deed in one hand and the EPA's contamination report in the other. "Constance," I said, my voice steady enough to carry across the water, "I didn't create this contamination. I just lowered the water enough to show what you've been hiding." I held up the deed. "This dam has been protecting this lake for a century. You were building luxury cabins on top of a toxic dump, selling families homes that would have poisoned their children." The reaction was instant. Shouts, camera flashes, reporters pushing forward. And in the middle of it, 2 federal agents stepped to Constance's side. The cuffs went on without ceremony. Her husband's bulldozers sat stranded in the muck as she was led to a black SUV. The lake she'd tried to exploit had turned on her. Justice has a sound, and it's not a gavel. It's the steady rush of water carrying the truth out into daylight. By the time the sun was high enough to burn off the morning mist, Timberlake looked nothing like the glossy postcard the HOA had been peddling. The once shimmering waterline had retreated into a jagged outline of muck and debris. Exposed foundations stood like crooked tombstones, and everywhere you looked, the lakebed bled secrets. Rusted machinery, skeletal docks, concrete slabs, and barrels leaking oily rainbows into the puddles. EPA techs moved like a small army, stringing yellow tape, snapping photographs, dropping sensors into shallow pools. The mobile lab they'd parked at the dam was already humming, pulling real-time readings on contaminants, lead, mercury, petroleum byproducts, chemicals so toxic their names belonged in a science journal, not in a family swimming hole. Dr. Bennett stood ankle-deep in the mud with her clipboard, her boots streaked dark. "We'll confirm it with lab analysis," she told a local news crew. "But there's no question. This is a major environmental crime scene." The federal takeover was instant. They didn't just shut down the cabin project, they froze all development permits within 5 miles of the lake. Heavy equipment was ordered off-site, crews dismissed under federal authority. Braden Peaton's construction company trucks rumbled away one by one, leaving deep tire ruts in the exposed mud. Judge Martinez stayed just long enough to watch it happen. She caught my eye from across the dam and gave the smallest nod. Not approval exactly, but recognition. The kind you give someone who played a long, dangerous game and won. For the first time in months, the silence on my dock didn't feel like a warning. It felt like peace. Across the lake, Constance's white Escalade was still parked, now surrounded by federal vehicles. She sat inside, a silhouette behind tinted glass, while agents boxed up paperwork and electronics from the temporary site office. I didn't need to hear her voice to know the pitch she was giving, the same breathless charm she'd used on half the county. But charm doesn't get you far when you're sitting under a federal investigation with fresh video evidence of your husband dumping toxic waste. By mid-afternoon, the agents left with her in custody. The cameras caught everything. The designer sunglasses, the tight jaw, the way she looked everywhere but at me as she stepped into the back seat of the SUV. I thought I'd feel triumphant watching her go. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired, in a way that settled into my bones. The kind of exhaustion that only comes after months of fighting a battle you didn't ask for. Jasper wandered over, holding 2 steaming paper cups from the diner. "Figured you could use something stronger than that thermos," he said, handing me one. We stood on the dam together, sipping burnt coffee, watching the EPA teams do what they do best. "They'll be here for months," Jasper said. "Maybe years." "Good," I said. "Let them turn over every rock." It didn't take long for the shockwaves to hit the rest of the community. By the 6 o'clock news, the Timberlake HOA was officially suspended pending legal review. Every homeowner on the lake had just watched the value of their property drop and then rebound in the same afternoon, from future luxury hotspot to environmental disaster zone, and now, under federal protection, the promise of eventual recovery. Pete at Kowalski's Hardware called that night, his voice awkward but genuine. "Ezra, I owe you an apology for not looking you in the eye before, for, listening to her." "It's over now, Pete," I told him, but I knew it wasn't. Not really. Federal cases take time. The cleanup would take longer. And there were still people here who'd been willing to sell me out for a little imagined boost in their property value. That doesn't just vanish when the headlines change. Still, that night, for the first time in months, I slept without waking, to the sound of engines or boots on gravel. The lake outside my window was lower, Yes, but quieter than it had been in years, like it could finally exhale. The next morning, I took my coffee to the dock and looked out over the mess. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. The lake wasn't pretending to be something it wasn't anymore. It was raw, scarred, and ready to heal. I knew then that this fight wasn't just about saving my family's land. It was about saving the water itself and making damn sure nobody ever tried to bury poison under it again. And I was ready for the long haul. 18 months later, Timberlake looked like something out of a nature magazine. The cleanup had been brutal. Months of dredging, hauling out tons of contaminated sediment, dismantling illegal retaining walls, and pulling up more chemical. Drums than anyone wanted to count. But when the EPA certified the water as clean again, the celebration was something this town hadn't seen in decades. $2.3 million in Superfund money had transformed the lake from a toxic wound into a living laboratory for ecological recovery. University researchers worked alongside EPA scientists, monitoring fish populations and planting native vegetation along the restored shoreline. Loons had returned, their calls echoing at dusk. The water was so clear you could see 15 feet down, just like when my grandfather was alive. Constance wasn't here to see it. She'd been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for environmental conspiracy, bribery, and fraud. Her husband, Braden, lost his construction license and filed for bankruptcy when the cleanup costs exceeded his insurance coverage by more than $2 million. The biggest house on the lake, their pride and joy, went at auction for 30 cents on the dollar. The Timberlake HOA didn't survive either. The board was dissolved, the bylaws rewritten, and Buck Morrison was elected president of the HOA. New association. The first thing they did was impose a 10-year development moratorium to protect the watershed while the ecosystem recovered. Funny thing, property values around the lake jumped 20% once the EPA declared it clean. Turns out buyers will pay more for pristine water than for luxury cabins built over a toxic dump. But numbers and court cases aren't what stuck with me. What stuck was the summer my son Derek brought his kids up for the first time since this all started. 3 generations on the dock, me, Derek, and little Sophie, fishing in the same spot my grandfather once stood. Sophie caught her first base, and when I reached down to pull the hook, I could see the lake bottom clear as day. That's when I realized this fight had never been just about land or even about winning against Constance. It was about making sure that someday my granddaughter could stand on this dock without worrying about what was beneath her feet. The dam itself had become a landmark. The county installed an interpretive trail with signs explaining its history, the environmental battle, and how ordinary citizens can use the law to fight corporate greed. School groups came every spring, their voices carrying across the water, as they learned how the lake was saved. And I found a new calling. My engineering consulting work shifted toward environmental protection. Communities from 3 states over started calling me when developers cut corners or HOAs got too big for their boots. Sometimes I testified in court. Sometimes I just sat in someone's kitchen with a coffee, showing them where to dig in their own records for leverage. Delilah and I got married last fall. We'd been partners in this fight from the moment she called me that Sunday night before the hearing, and somewhere between court filings and coffee-fueled strategy sessions, we realized we worked just as well outside of battle. Now she investigates. I provide technical expertise, and together we've stopped 6 illegal developments and helped prosecute 4 corrupt officials. Every once in a while, I still walk down to the dam at dawn and rest my hands on those brass wheels. The metal is warm from the summer air, the motion smooth as silk, and for a second, I can almost feel my grandfather standing beside me, his hands guiding mine. Conservation isn't just about preserving the past. It's about protecting the future, making sure there's something worth inheriting when we're gone. And here, in this place, we did it. Some mornings I catch myself standing at the dam longer than I mean to. I'll pour coffee from my grandfather's old steel thermos, lean on the railing, and watch the sun break over Timberlake. The loons glide by, The water is glass, and the air is so clean you can taste the pine. 18 months of cleanup left scars. Bare patches where the shoreline vegetation hasn't fully grown back. Sections of lake bed still cordoned off for sediment monitoring. But the life has come back. Faster than I ever dared hope. Fish are spawning in coves that used to be dead zones. Families camp along the shore for our annual Clean Water Days festival, kids learning about ecology while their parents swap stories about the bad old days, when greed almost swallowed this. Lake whole. We even started the Timberlake Conservation Scholarship, $15,000 a year for students studying environmental engineering. We fund it with savings from the cleanup budget, proof that sometimes federal efficiency can outmatch local corruption. I make a point of handing out the award myself every spring, telling each winner the same thing. The law is a tool. Use it before someone uses it against you. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. Property research always starts with your deed. Those old papers can hide rights you didn't know you had. Rights powerful enough to stop a bad deal cold. Tax auction properties? Sometimes they're more valuable than they look, especially if local government has forgotten to maintain them. And when you find environmental contamination, you're not just protecting your own land, you're stepping into a fight where the federal government has your back, no matter how deep your opponent's pockets are. I learned that bullies, whether they're wearing HOA pins or $1,000 watches, all make the same mistake when they're desperate. They get sloppy. They leave trails. And if you're patient, you can follow those trails right to the truth. That's what my grandfather meant when he said, sometimes the best solutions are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to turn the wheel. Constance won't be back here. Federal prison has a way of changing people, and her empire is gone. The house, the board, the influence. Braden's out of construction and working off debts he'll never fully clear. Timberlake's new HOA has a very different mandate. Protect, preserve, and never forget how close we came to losing it all. I still get messages from people across the country telling me about their HOA horror stories. Some just want to vent. Others want advice. And more often than not, I hear the same fear in their voices that I felt when Constance parked her Escalade sideways across my driveway that first day. The fear of being small against something that feels impossibly big. But here's the truth. You're not as small as you think. You just need the right leverage. Sometimes it's a clause in a deed. Sometimes it's a tax record buried in a dusty cabinet. Sometimes it's the simple fact that the law protects clean water more fiercely than it protects profit margins. The lake has taught me this. Patience is power, and timing is everything. The water doesn't rush unless you open the gate. When the day's work is done, and the light fades over the pines, I still walk to the dam. I still rest my hands on those brass wheels, feeling the smooth metal under my palms. And I still hear my grandfather's voice, low and steady. Some things are worth fighting for, no matter how steep the odds. If you've got your own HOA nightmare, tell me about it. I read every single one, and sometimes your stories point me toward the next fight worth taking. And trust me, next week's fight is one you won't want to miss. I'm going to tell you about the farmer who found out his neighbor's $1 million mansion was built entirely on his land, and the genius way he turned the tables. Until then, keep your eyes open, your paperwork close, and remember, sometimes the quietest wheels turn the biggest tides.